The Technology Infrastructure Lab at NC State's Friday Institute has been working with DPI for over a decade on the topic of school connectivity, and I feel like we have a lot of interesting data to share. And there's some interesting topics going on about the requirement for bandwidth to schools that I think we need to address. So, first, I'd like to show the Connect K-12 dashboard, which this is the group that has taken over for Education Superhighway for providing data about school connectivity. And they have a pretty interesting tool that's useful for seeing what other districts are paying and I guess going through the E-rate data to determine what a good price is and who has what connectivity. And that's very useful, actually. I think what's not so useful is this push for 1 megabit per student at the internet, and it's causing some problems, and it could be not in the public interest to be measuring people on that metric. So I'm just going to show their dashboard right here, which you can scroll over each state and dig down. It's pretty slick, actually. But North Carolina, we're being told that 45% of our students have over 1 megabit per student. Well, that may be true, but is that a problem? And that's, I think, where we're misdirecting some of our focus by focusing just on that one number and not really the whole picture. So here we are, about halfway in the pack with the country. I'm not sure how Hawaii has such great internet access, but maybe the Trans-Pacific cable stopped through Hawaii on the way to California. I guess if we dig into this a little bit more, we can see their data is coming from E-rate, which is useful, but it doesn't tell the whole story. We have fiber to every school in the state, 2,600 schools. We've had fiber to every school for several years now, and we have Wi-Fi in every classroom. So I think we've effectively used E-rate to its fullest potential in the state, and we will hopefully continue to do that for many years to come. If you look at this data, though, it's not exactly flattering to say only 45% of our students have 1 megabit. And the problem with that is that we have a statewide backbone, and our traffic is all aggregated up to that backbone. So we get economies of scale of having 1.5 million students all in our backbone, and that's just the K-12 students. We also have 58 community colleges, all the public universities, and many of the private universities. So the smallest school district in the state is able to get the same internet experience as Duke University. And that is pretty impressive. And that's all done through having a statewide backbone. That backbone is called the North Carolina Research and Education Network, and it's hosted by and owned by MCNC, which was a company that was started by the General Assembly back in 1980 out in RTP, and they have a statewide fiber footprint. It's a very valuable asset to the students and taxpayers of North Carolina. So if we look at the data that we get from this backbone, though, we can see, well, let me real quick go to where did this 1 megabit thing come from. 1 megabit per student is measured as, and this is in the E-rate modernization order from the FCC, is 1 gigabit per 1,000 users in the long term. We're in the long term now. This was 2015. So, and internet connectivity will be measured at the district level. So that is the long-term goal. And then if we go down a little bit further, it's 10 gigabits per 1,000 students for the WAN, or the last mile. And that is basically saying 10 megabits per student for the WAN and 1 megabit per student for the internet. Well, right off the bat, the problem with that is, why are we having a 10-to-1 ratio of WAN to internet? That, seems a little extreme to be a mandate we're going to measure people on. We should actually be measuring the performance of the network and buying appropriately. And so to blindly overbuy 10-to-1 ratio of WAN to internet, not taking into account the size of the school district, the teaching model in use, and a whole bunch of other factors, that's kind of potentially leading people to buy way more internet than they actually need, or even way more WAN capacity. So for example, I have seen school districts that will have a 10 gig fiber to a elementary school with 200 kids. And in some of the ways the contracts are written, that may be the cost-effective way to go, but that may not always be the most cost-effective way. But that's how the E-rate rules work sometimes. And if the overall cost for the entire district is the lowest price, then we can't really complain about that. But I would say that it's not always necessary to go after these arbitrary targets. And some of the data we have to support that would be our MCNC measures our backbone usage, peak utilization, and average utilization are reported using the 95 percentile 5-minute method. I think it's taken during school hours 7 to 3 or so. You can go to the MCNC website and see all about it, but it's using industry standard terms for performance and techniques for measuring performance. And they report that, and every year we put it into a dashboard that we provide to DPI and the school board and the General Assembly, which lets people know where the growth is going and things. Now this year we've had, obviously with the COVID situation, the demand for bandwidth is different than it has been in the past years. However, it's not, I don't think it's gonna be reduced when we come back. When we come back to school, I think if anything, we'll be using digital resources even more now that we've had a year to be kind of thrust into using them. And so I think we need to be prepared for an uptick in that. So what this graph here is showing is the history since 2012, when the school connectivity really got into swing, of total aggregate bandwidth across all the school districts. This is not charter schools. I have them on a separate chart. So all the school districts. And this is what we are actually contracted with, and by we I mean the state is contracted with the state backbone, MCNC, to provide to the K-12 schools. And then that's broken out by school district speeds. So the 60 gigabits of capacity is just 2 school districts, and that's obviously Wake and Charlotte. So down here we get to the smaller school districts, and we can see that there are 28 districts that all have 1 gigabit connections, and then there are even a couple more districts that have slower connections. But I think this is interesting to explore, but the point being, and we'll get into some of the other graphs, is that the internet connections vary in speeds across the state, from 100 megabit for a district up to 30 gigabits for a district. This is the same data broken out by month. And this is where it gets to me a little bit more interesting to get onto the point of overbuying. So I'm going to show just the districts with under 50,000 kids. So I think I took off a couple. So this is the vast majority of the state, leaving Wake and Charlotte out because they are a little bit different. On the x-axis, we have the number of students enrolled, and on the y-axis, we have the average per student utilization in kilobits per second pre-COVID. So this is the February 2020, which would be probably one of the highest utilization months that we've had before we sent everybody home. So what you would expect to see is, according to the FCC requirement of 1 megabit, well, we're nowhere near that. We're at 250 kilobits. So 0.25 megabits is the top of this graph. So why is that? Well, there's lots of things we need to go into to figure that out. But if you just pick a school district, you can hover over it and you can see here they have 4 gig contracted bandwidth, 8,455 students, and then the peak utilization was 213. I'm sorry, that's the average, 213 kilobits, but the contracted is 473. So they don't have a megabit per kid, but they're contracted at 473 kilobits, almost half of what the Connected Nation and FCC goal is. So if we go out to Cumberland, which is, I believe, our third biggest school district, it's 151 contracted per student and average utilization of 94. Well, so is that a problem? How is it that this big school district has a lower number than this small school district? Lenore is fairly small. Well, that goes into the whole concept of oversubscription. And the more students you have sharing the resource, the less the per student value needs to be. And this goes back into communications theory many years, back into the phone network even. The old school telephone network could not provide a dial tone to everybody at exactly the same time. There was a guy named Erlang that invented some algorithms on how to figure that out, and the FCC had rules and regulations on what percentage of the population needed to be able to pick up the phone and get a dial tone within 1 second or whatever the thing was. And so that was all engineered. And I think we need something a little bit more nuanced like that than just a flat, here we need a megabit a kid. And while I agree that we definitely need to fund school connectivity better and make sure we're keeping the students connected, what I would hate to see is us spending, a lot of money to give a little school with 200 kids 10 gigabits while we still have some schools in the country that don't even have any connectivity. And to me, that's the bigger concern, is the spirit of universal service is that everybody gets connected, and not everybody is connected. And that is the bigger problem than the 1 megabit per student. And I think in North Carolina, we're in great shape for the schools. So I would say I think we have this dialed in, and we're operating really well. The homework gap is the problem in North Carolina, second most rural state in the country, behind Texas when you look at some of the statistics around population density and what it means to be rural. So I always like to compare us to like a state like Utah, where you may drive 50 miles and not see a home, and then all of a sudden there's a little town. And that's a different type of rural than in North Carolina, where there's a town about every 10 miles, because going back to farming in the 1800s and the railroad, it was basically the aggregation point for the farmers was about every 10 miles. That's how far they could carry their goods to market, and on horse and buggy, and then they'd be put on the train. So the towns were evenly spaced, and we have a population density issue that's kind of unique there, and that we don't have many huge vast areas with no one. We have some national forests and things like that in the mountains that are awesome. If you've never been, you should go. But the reality is we just have a very, outside of the few big cities, we have a very evenly spread suburban rolling hills kind of a house here and there. And that problem is much more difficult to solve, especially with fiber. So that's probably going to be, wireless will be a big solution for us in the state for the homework gap. But the point being, the Universal Service Fund, has 4 components, and E-rate is just one of those. So by pushing these huge connections to schools for E-rate, are we taking money out of other programs in the Universal Service portfolio? That's another thing I think we probably need to be considering. I'm just going to go over a couple more of these charts just while I'm in here to this dashboard, and the links will be in the description below. But the per student bandwidth going back to 2012, it was in 18 kilobits per student, and now we're at 224. A large portion of that was the thrust in the 2015 timeframe to really ramp up the number of one-to-one programs and to allow students to bring their devices into the classroom and things. And the contracted bandwidth, which I think is one of the most, the realities of the virus. this is the contracted bandwidth, the peak and average utilizations. And here, obviously, is March 2020, and we went home and pretty much went all the way back to our 2013 level. Obviously, this data is not useful, okay? So I would not make any predictions of this. I would continue to follow this trend line for my prediction for 2021 when everybody goes back to school, if not slightly ramped up from this because of the increased use of digital technology. The other thing I wanted to point out is there's a big gap between the contracted bandwidth and the peak. So here, even, you might say that we're overbuying. Well, remember, that's the contracted across all of our K-12 schools, and these metrics are taken every 5 minutes. So there is a potential that there's a peak, up somewhere where one district is using a lot and another one isn't, and so it all averages out across the 115 school districts. So again, this is statistics, and that's what you have to consider. But I think this provides a realistic view of the trend that we're seeing, and honestly, after COVID and in this year, I don't expect massive growth in demand. So I won't say it's going to stop. It will continue. But we've had quite a ramp up because we went from almost no computers to everybody has a computer almost, or a device. And I think that the applications may become richer and there'll be more video content and such. But the big knee jerk up and to the right of the last 5 years in terms of the number of devices is probably not going to happen again. And I don't think there's any one app that everyone is going to have that is an absolute bandwidth killer. So, let's be a little bit more realistic about what our expectations are. I know everybody wants to talk about how we're going to have augmented reality and virtual reality and all that, but we need to really focus on getting everyone at some level of a good, solid digital curriculum that they can use and ideally use at home. So I think that's all I have to show on this spreadsheet or this dashboard. And I encourage people to poke around and look at it and dig into the data. We also do all the data for the charter schools, and they too have seen just a phenomenal growth. Also, what we've got here going on is there's more and more charter schools. So pre-2015 or so, I don't remember the exact year, there was only 100 charter schools allowed in the state, and that limit, that cap was taken off. And so just the pure number of charter schools that we have now has gone up. They don't aggregate bandwidth across multiple schools, right? So there's they are as peers in terms of units on the state backbone. A district and a charter school appear to be the same thing. That's the entity at which point we would manage or measure the consumption. And the other thing to remember about charter schools is that all 115 school districts are on the NC-REN backbone. I think only about half, not even half the charter schools are, but a fair number. And that's a function of does it make sense for us to run a backbone fiber to every charter school when there might be much cheaper commercial services available, especially for some small charter schools that are in areas that have tons of competition. So urban settings, and they have tons of competition. It might not be cost effective to try to compete with that. So all the charter schools are free to make their own decision, as are the school districts. The school districts are free to choose who they use for internet. It just, I think, happens that all 115 of them have realized that the state-provided internet works great, and they have someone they can call when they need help. And we've had a pretty successful program with school connectivity. One more thing I think that would be worth going into is the NC-REN actual utilization map, which is very nice. This is hosted by MCNC. And if we go back to February 2020, you can actually see each district, each county, and the district and all the charter schools that are in it and on the NC backbone. And you can see the utilization of each entity and by student, peak, and average. So if we go back to peak day utilization, we have some counties that are up in the 300 kilobit range, those are the high points. Now that's a question of what exactly are they doing there that's different, and that's a research project we probably want to do here at the Friday Institute, is to really dig into the learning methodologies that are used in some of these counties that are the outliers, and then some of the other ones that are not high. For example, Guilford, which I believe is the fourth largest district, or maybe third. Cumberland and Guilford are the third and fourth. I just can't remember the order. But we see here their per student utilization is in the 40 to 50 kilobit range. So that would be indicative of a school that probably needs to spend more money on their devices for students and training teachers to use digital resources more than their internet. The network here, the NC-RED network, they monitor these locations, and every time I believe 60% is hit of the contracted bandwidth on an ongoing basis, they automatically up the circuit to the next speed. So that gives plenty of headroom. So if they see a utilization over a certain threshold for a period of time, that district will then be put in for an upgrade, and that's what provides what is I call the appearance of infinite bandwidth. A school district should not actually see their internet connection be pegged out. I've never seen it. I'm sure it may happen if there's something really bad going on the network, probably, but it's probably not due to educational issues. I know that there are some districts that have built for their worst case scenario, and they've never actually seen it, and in other states, and I feel like that's kind of overbuying, and we should be more careful about how we spend the E-rate dollars, especially considering that the universal service fee is, I think, 27% this quarter, which is the highest it's ever been. So that funding is dependent on other services, and people that are using interstate connections are paying a tax on their services to pay for these things. So it's something we need to consider. Anyway, the links are all below, and I'll have more videos on some other E-rate data we've got, and we'll go into more details about how we got this data.